Now, let's talk about the agency problem. That is when you expend other people's resources differently than you would expend your own. Now, let me give you an example. You go home for the winter break, and your dad says, "Oh, I need to go to the store. Can you take me?" And you say, "Sure." And you get in your car, and your dad says, "Your car is an absolute piece of junk. You need a new car." What do you say? Okay, we're going to get to that. Now, your dad says, "You need to get a new car. Let's go get you a new car." And you're like, "Yeah." Now, right now, who do you assume is paying for the car?
Your dad.
Your dad, right? Now, I want you to picture in your head the car that your dad is going to buy you. Do you have it in your head? Okay, now you are driving to the mile of cars in your hometown, because every town has one, the mile of cars, right? And you get there, and your dad says, "By the way, you're paying for it." I want you to picture in your head the car that you have in mind now. Did the car change?
Absolutely.
Yeah, Mr. Bowrichter, what was your first car?
The first car was Bronco.
A Bronco, like the big one with the leaky roof, or the little one?
No, or I don't know, the big one.
The big one. The big one with the leaky roof. Okay. So, but after you found out you're paying for it, what is the vehicle?
Something very fuel efficient.
Yeah, something like a Toyota Corolla, right? Because you assumed Dad was going to pay for the gas, too. Okay. Do you view yourself as a terrible person? No, that's human, right? That's just how humans think. It's called rational self-interest. Now, let's ask this question. If you think about at the company, who's making the decisions on how to spend the money? Is it the shareholders? No, it's the managers. And so the managers have control over how to spend the shareholders' money. And so that's the first place that this comes from. In fact, it's the place where it comes from, is the separation of ownership and control. I own stock in a lot of companies, but I don't have any control over how their managers spend the money. The managers may own some of the stock, but they don't own very much of it. And so as a result, they're going to spend that money differently than their own. And it's even worse when we have a corporation that's publicly traded. Let me explain to you why. Let's think about this. If we are partners, let's say that you and I are partners, and it's 50-50. If you waste $1 of the firm's money, how much of your own money are you actually wasting?
Well,
50 cents, right? 50 cents. Okay, now all four of us are in business together, and you waste $1 of the firm's money. How much does it cost you? A quarter! And you don't have to be evil to think this way. My sister is a relatively decent person. She's a partner in a 4-person organization. And so I go to her house, and I see this amazing computer screen, and it's like almost floating in midair. It's just freaking amazing. It's curved, and it's huge. And I'm like, wow, how much did that cost? And it was ridiculous. I forget how much. But she says, but I only really have to pay 25% of that, right? Is she a bad person? No, she just knows how to do the math. Now, here's the problem. Every time I waste $1, it only costs me a quarter. Every time you waste $1, it only costs you a quarter. Every time you waste $1, it only costs you a quarter. Every time you waste $1, it only costs you a quarter. What does that mean about the amount of money that gets wasted at a firm? It's huge, right? Now, let's talk about what happens when the managers own even less of the firm. I had, and I'm going to cut this story short for the sake of brevity, I had a boss. So when I was first a salesman, my boss says, I'm going to go with you to meet your customers. And so I was talking to the other salespeople, and I said, wow, that's really nice of Bob. You know, I've never done sales before. And they laughed, and they said, it's not nice of Bob. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to get out there, and on the first night, he's going to take you to an expensive restaurant. You're going to rack up a big bill, and then he's going to slide the bill over to you. I said, what? They said, yeah, just wait. Sure enough, it's exactly what happened. Long story short, We've got, oh, by the way, if you ask a server, anyone here a server at a restaurant? If I ask you, what's good today, what are you going to tell me?
Most expensive.
The most expensive one. Why? Because you're expecting a tip based on the percentage, right? And so Bob asks the server for what's best, and of course she tells him something extravagantly expensive, right? Because, so that's the first example of the agency problem that we see. The second is that Bob orders not only this steak, which was called the manhole cover, it's that big, right? He orders one of all of the side dishes, including asparagus, which just is like sad and limp, right? So he orders, but it's expensive. He orders all that stuff and a bottle of wine. Now let's talk about the best value on the wine list at a restaurant. What do most people order when they go to a restaurant? Do they order the cheapest wine on the menu?
Depends on the restaurant.
You guys are
Restaurant depends on day, depends on budget.
far too sophisticated. Typically, for the uninitiated, what they do is they get the second cheapest wine on the menu. Why the second cheapest?
Don't want to look very cheap.
They don't want to look cheap, right? They are cheap, but they don't want to look cheap. Do you think restaurant owners know that?
Of course.
Of course. What do you think is the worst value on the whole wine list? It's the second from the bottom, right? That's the worst value on the entire wine list. By the way, Bob wasn't limited by that because after all, he's spending, is it his money? No. In fact, Bob owns 1% of the firm. That's something I hadn't told you yet. Bob owns 1% of the firm. Okay, at the end of the night, the bill is $300. And keep in mind, this is like 2002. Oh yeah. And so, and Bob has been flirting with the waitress who's 8.5 months pregnant. He's been flirting with her the whole night, and he says, give her a good tip. Because after all, he has slid the bill over to me. Now, so I'm going to give her a good tip. So let's say I threw $50 on there. I think that was roughly it. And then, why do I not care that I mean, this is on my expense account, right? Why do I not care? I don't own any of the firm shares, right? And so now the bill is $350. How much is Bob actually spending for this dinner? $3.50, which is, by the way, what Bob would spend on himself at Taco Bell when he was on his own dime. Does that make sense? Now, do you see how the separation of ownership and control leads to these problems? Now picture yourself as a CEO of one of these huge multi-billion-dollar kinds of companies. What kinds of things are you going to engage in? So let's talk about that. Now, by the way, am I telling you to do these things? No. My colleagues in management, sometimes they say, oh, we shouldn't teach students about the agency problem because then they'll go and act out these behaviors. And I say, that's like saying you shouldn't teach your kids about sex because then they won't have sex, right? This is human nature. People are going to do this stuff. And so why am I telling you this? Because you need to be in a position to control this kind of behavior among your own employees, right? Okay. Now, wasteful spending. What about corporate jets? You guys know what a corporate jet is? Private jet? First of all, terrible for the environment. Most of the time, the CEOs that are flying these things are, they're great advocates for the environment, and then what do? You're going out and flying in a private jet. And so it's like 40 times worse than first class as far as your carbon footprint goes. Now, let's make it even worse. True story. Jeff Immelt, the CEO of GE at the time, he not only had his private jet, he had an identical jet following along. Why?
Safety protection.
Just in case the first one broke down, God forbid Jeff have to get a first class ticket with you people, right? Now, do you think the shareholders, by the way, do you think the shareholders knew about the second jet? No. They didn't know until after he was gone that finally came out. And CEOs will actually make the arguments, oh, my time is so valuable, and I've got to be protected and this kind of stuff. So they'll make these arguments for private jets. And that all sounds legitimate until you learn that when the CEO goes on vacation on their own dime, that they fly commercial, right? If all these things they're saying are true, shouldn't they also be flying private for their leisure time? But they're not. People are scumbags. Okay, you also see these huge vanity projects like Apple's headquarters. You guys know about Apple's headquarters? It looks like a freaking spaceship, right? It's a vanity project for Tim Cook, and it started out Steve Jobs and he died. Anyway, vanity project. Now, the real funny thing is they sunk over $1 billion or whatever into this thing, and then what happens? COVID. Totally unoccupied, right? Okay, so that's the kind of wasteful spending we're looking at here. And then we see empire building. Now, let's discuss, there is nothing wrong with acquiring a firm if doing so maximizes shareholder wealth. There's nothing wrong with acquiring a firm as long as doing so maximizes shareholder wealth. However, do you think all acquisitions do that? No, in fact, sometimes the acquisitions are more for the pleasure of the CEO than anything else. Let's give some examples. By the way, I'm just going to throw some numbers out here. Mr. Jaquez, you are the CEO of a $100 million in assets company. Remind me of your last name?
Holman.
Holman. You are the CEO of a $200 million assets company. Which one of these guys is more important? He is. Which one of these guys has a bigger office? He does. Which one of these guys gets better tea time at the golf course? He does. Which one of these guys has a more attractive mistress? Well, no, I know you're giving him credit for the naturally curly hair, but $100 million, right? Okay. Mr. Green, apparently my camera is attracted to you. Thing's about as well behaved as my dogs. Okay, so do you start to see why it's good to be the CEO of a big company, right? And so, what does this mean? It means Mr. Jaquez says, I can golf at the same club he does. I'm going to go out and we're going to start an string of acquisitions so we can get the company up to $200 million in assets. Now that would be perfectly fine if all the companies you were buying would maximize shareholder wealth. But do you think it's likely that they do? In fact, it's quite unlikely. We're going to learn that in chapter 21. Okay, and so what he does is he goes out and not only does he buy things that are maybe not the best acquisitions, but he buys things that are of interest to him. For instance, there is an American industrial conglomerate named Eaton, E-A-T-O-N. And E-A-T-O-N, Eaton, and keep in mind, I haven't really researched them for a long time because it's been 25 years since I got a job offer from them. Anyway, so I did my research back then. And they had industrial electrical equipment. They had industrial hydraulic equipment. They had industrial this, industrial that, and the golf grips division. Anyone here play golf? What's a golf grip? Yeah, the thing you hold up at the top. What does that have to do with hydraulic motors? You can tell I can't play golf, right? What does that have to do with hydraulic motors? Nothing. Why do you think the CEO would have been interested in buying a golf grips company? He what?
So he gets them for free.
Oh, he not only gets them for free, but what else? Where are we going to hold the board meetings? Near a golf course, right? Golf courses to CEOs are like fresh litter boxes to cats, right? It just attracts them like flies. And so he gets this golf grips, and then we're able to hold all of our, this year we're doing Pebble Beach, next year it's going to be Hilton Head, and then we're going to do the old course at St. Andrews. Do you see how this works? It made no sense whatsoever for them to buy that. It's obvious that it's one of these empire building activities. Don't do that. Only acquire businesses that are going to maximize shareholder wealth. Now let's talk about shirking. Anybody know what shirking is?
When you skip school.
Yeah, it's the opposite of working. It's the opposite of working. Now, you might not even think about CEOs being able to shirk, but they can, right? So I'll give you an example of a personal example. I had an employee named Roy in Dallas, Texas. And this is how Roy would move when he was working for me. He was very slow. He would go down to the tool room and he's like, oh, hey, how are the kids? Did you get to do any fishing this weekend? Yeah. And then he talks for maybe 10, 15 minutes, and then he does this. He says, well, I better get moving before Haggard sees me, right? And he says, go ahead and give me the 98 double aught whatever tool that he was looking for. And then he goes back. And he goes back very slowly, of course. Now, one weekend, my wife and I are out driving around, and we happen to drive by Roy's house. And something you need to know about Roy is that even though he was a 42-year-old man, which seemed old to me at the time, but now does not, he was a 42-year-old man, his hobby was racing go-karts. Now, can you just go out and buy racing go-karts? Maybe you can now, but back then you had to build them, right? And so Roy's out there working on his racing go-kart, and this is what it looked like. Yeah. He is moving like, I slam on the brakes. My wife says, what's wrong? I said, there's something wrong with Roy, right? Now, why do you think Roy was working so hard at his house and so not hard on my shop floor? It's the agency problem. Who's getting 100% of the benefit of Roy's work when he's at home? He is. And by the way, his wife's probably told him he also has to mow the yard or he can't go racing tomorrow, right? So he's probably in a hurry. Ladies, keep that in mind if you want the yard mowed. Okay, back to the story. So, but when he's working for me, what does he do? He works only hard enough to keep from getting fired. Does that make sense? Okay. That's shirking. CEOs will do the same thing. And the older that they get, the bigger the problem is. We'll talk about why that is. We don't want to see that. Okay. Those are my old glasses, like 3 glasses ago. Okay, so how do we control the agency problem? Well, first of all, managerial compensation contracts. If I just pay you $1 million a year, and regardless of your output, how are you going to behave? You're going to shirk, right? You're not going to care. And so what I want to do is give you a compensation contract that aligns your interests with those of the shareholders. We need to align your interests with those of the shareholders. So how are we going to do that? Stock options, stock grants. We're going to give you a bonus when the stock hits a certain level. Now, we're not going to do things based on accounting numbers because after all, managers have a lot of discretion over accounting. And if we do it based on accounting numbers, then they will just kind of try to jigger the accounting numbers. And so I was talking to a friend of mine who runs a railroad, and his name is Greg. And I always want to hear about how my material gets applied in the real world. And I said, Greg, do you guys think about maximizing shareholder wealth? And he said, no. I said, what do you think about? He says, I think about maximizing Greg's bonus, right? Greg's bonus isn't based on the share price. It's based on some numbers of which Greg has partial control of, right? Does that make sense? So we don't want to use accounting numbers for that. Okay, so we're going to compensate them to align their interests, to make them think more like an owner. Number 2, there's the managerial labor market. You may not think of managers as labor, but they are. I'm labor. I'm standing up here and trading my time for money. That makes me labor. Does that make sense? Even though I'm wearing a tie, I am labor. Okay, so the managerial labor market. There is a labor market out there for CEOs. And that market doesn't have a whole lot of people in it, right? And when you do something bad as a CEO, it gets published in the Wall Street Journal. And so I do something bad as a CEO, it gets published in the Wall Street Journal, my company fires me. Now, when I go out and apply for new jobs, what happens? Yeah, probably out of luck, right? And so, that might not, so in this example, the person's already done the bad behavior. But knowing that, Might I restrain my bad behavior to try to avoid winding up in the Wall Street Journal and to try to avoid getting fired? Absolutely. So that's how the managerial labor market constrains these things. And then we have the market for corporate control. We're talking about takeovers here, mergers, acquisitions, that sort of stuff. If your share price is high, your company is hard to take over because people will have to pay a lot for it. But if you are a bad manager and your share price gets really low, then I could probably write a check for your company, right? It'd be real easy for me to take it over. Now, why would the CEO care if I were going to take over their firm? I'm going to fire him, right? Because after all, they're the clown that drove the share price down to where it is now, right? And so they don't want the company to get taken over because they don't want to lose their jobs. And so as a result, they are incentivized to try to keep the share price at least high enough that the firm isn't an attractive takeover firm or target. And then we have monitoring. Monitoring is when you keep your eyes on someone. In fact, you guys are going to take your exams through something called Respondus Monitor. What is that? Anybody use that before? What is it?
It's the lockdown browser.
Uh-huh.
This is
The camera. Now, let's ask this question and be honest. When are you more likely to behave yourself?
When you're being watched.
When you're being I didn't even have to give the choices. She jumped right on it. When you're being watched. I gave this talk in a night class one time. I had a guy in the back row. I said, you know, those cameras in Taco Bell, you guys may not be so lowbrow as to eat in Taco Bell, but I am. Go to Taco Bell. There are cameras everywhere. Do you know what the most important camera in that whole store is?
Cash.
The cash register. Why? Yeah, people, the employees steal from the managers or the owners. And the guy in the corner laughed. I said, what are you laughing about? He says, I'm a manager at Taco Bell. He says, that's the only camera in my whole store that actually works. Okay, that's monitoring. Now, we can do similar things with CEOs. We can try to figure out whether they've got the extra plane trailing, and they've got all sorts of things we can do to try to figure out if they're doing their jobs correctly. Who do you think is more likely to act in the shareholder's interest? One who is being watched or one who basically knows that there's nobody looking? The one who's being watched, right? So that's monitoring. Are there any questions?